And class is in session. You're listening to Shit Shooting 101. I'm your host, Joshua Lee. Joining us today, author of such books as Panama Red, Meat Market, The Smalls, A Short History of DMT, A Short History of American Intelligence Services. His newest book, Atlantis Solved, The Final Definitive Proof, and many, many others. Wading through the murky waters of discarded history, sifting through the muds of a devoured past, sweeping back the sands of a spilled hourglass to reclaim a lost people, a lost land, and lost reasoning. Here to dust away the cobwebs of Atlantis and resuscitate the life of Atlantean desire in the hearts of us all, it's David Edward. David, welcome to the show.
Josh, it's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, this is super cool. I haven't had anybody on to discuss the lost city of Atlantis, so this is going to be an excellent conversation. And I know my listeners are thoroughly going to enjoy this as well as I. So I just want to dive in. That's how I like to do it. In your book, Atlantis Solved, you've made a very convincing case for not only the fact of Atlantis' existence, but for its exact location as well. So let's not bury the lead here. If the lost city of Atlantis is not in the Mediterranean, in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, South America, or even Antarctica, where is it and how can we be certain this is it, the real deal?
Okay, all right. Well, that's good. And first off, thank you very much for having me on, and thank you for reading the book. I knew someone had read it, and now I'm finally getting to meet you. So that's fantastic. Yeah. So basically, let me just set the book up. I'll answer your question, but what the book does is it kind of pushes away all of the noise around Atlantis, and it says, let's go to the primary sources that we have for it, and let's decompose it because we're modern people. Let's take an engineering approach, and let's see if it can be solved. Let's see if there's a place that actually, fits it. And like you said, there's lots of places out there. There's the Azore Islands people like, the Atlantic Ridge, Spain, the Bimini Island, Antarctica, Santorini, Malta, and the list goes on and on and on. I don't think it's any of those places because I don't think they fit everything that Plato said. We have to match everything he said, not dismiss anything. I think the only place that really has a legitimate claim is Western Africa.
And do you care to explain why that is? Because I know that's going to be like a big mind blow for a lot of people. There may be a few who have heard that theory before, but I don't think it's going to be the majority of people. So what led you to Western Africa?
Sure.
Sahara, right?
The Western Sahara. So we're talking about largely the Western Africa below Morocco, and then through a country called Mauritania, which has a coastline on the Atlantic Ocean, and then inland through Central Africa to basically Mali, which has a ring of low mountains. Yeah, so I can see, Josh, you're the kind of person that likes to skip to the end of the book to see how it ends before we start. So yeah,
I like to reverse engineer from time to time.
There's a lot of setup. So let's start answering your question this way, which is what we're talking about, this thing called the Richat structure. Now it's been out there, and many people have talked about it. Matter of fact, anyone who knows about it probably knows about it from this fella named Jimmy Corsetti, who has a channel on YouTube called Bright Insight. And he, in 2018, did a couple videos where he said, gosh, this thing really looks like Atlantis. And he did some pretty good research. And it went viral and it really caught on. He's got, 4 or 5 million views on this thing. And for a while, everyone's kind of blown away. And they're blown away because when you look at the Richat structure, it is the only geology on the planet that we can look at without an explanation. And it looks like what we're told about Atlantis. Because the classic thing with Atlantis is there was a center island, and then there were alternating rings of water and land, right? 2 rings of land, 3 rings of water. And that's what we have. But it's in the middle of the Sahara Desert. So we have to start to understand a couple of things. We have to start to look at the time period. We have to look at the source material. And then we have to combine those two things and see if this Richat structure thing aligns with what we know about Atlantis, and if it's feasible, given what we know was going on the planet at this time period. Now, the time period we're talking about is 9600 BCE. And it's pretty well established. No, it's not really argued that that's the time that Plato is literally talking about. Some people might argue he got the date wrong, but that's what he says. And 9600 BCE is a very important date. It's almost amazing that he would have a tale of destruction from that time, and we look at it, and there's a couple things going on in 9600 BCE. The first thing going on is we are at the end of the last ice age, and we're in something called the Neolithic, the pre-pottery Neolithic, which is the time period that dates to from about 10,000 BC to about 6500 BCE. We're actually part of something called the Neolithic Revolution. So just like we had the Cultural Revolution, we had the Renaissance, we had the Neolithic Revolution, the Neolithic Renaissance. And now, Neolithic, what does Neolithic mean? Neolithic means neo and lithic, so new Stone Age, not to be confused with the Mesolithic or the Paleolithic, which is the Middle Stone Age, and the Old Stone Age, or the Older Stone Age. We also know that agriculture kicked off about 10,000 BC. So we're about 400 years after the first signs of agriculture that we find. And by agriculture, what we mean is the transition of basically hunter-gatherers into societies that could grow their own food. So they stayed in one place. And by growing their own food, everyone wasn't busy, hunting. So people could start to specialize. You could specialize in, hunting or being a defender, or raising crops, or raising animals, or making clothes, or making weapons, whatever it is, people could start to specialize. So all of that is going on at this time period of 9600 BCE in West Africa. Now, the other thing about West Africa that's interesting, because I mentioned we're at the end of the last ice age, is there's an event that happens, and it's called the Younger Dryas event. And the Younger Dryas event happened in 9600 BCE. We all talk about it, and it's kind of a famous event. And the thing that ties Atlantis and that transition in that really helps us is Göbekli Tepe, which was found in Turkey, which also dates to this exact same date, 9600 BCE. So so something was going on. Now, at the end of the Younger Dryas, some event happens, and the temperature of the Earth goes up about 40 or 50 degrees Fahrenheit, very, very rapidly, within a year or two, or maybe less. So the oceans are rising, and something happens. Some people think it might have been a comet impact. The poles might have shifted a little bit. No one really knows. But it's called the Younger Dryas. So another question might be, well, what the heck's a Dryas, right? And then just like the Neolithic and Paleolithic, we have three Dryases. We have the Younger Dryas that we're talking about. Then we have the Older Dryas and the Oldest Dryas. And the Dryas is just a flowering plant that grows really well in colder, higher elevations. So when scientists go and look and try and figure out what the temperatures were around these times, they look for how many of these plants were growing, and where that is in the soil level, so they know how far back it is, and they can see that this temperature change happened. So the last thing that was going on in the Sahara was the Green Sahara. So meaning that the place this Rishat structure is, which is currently the Sahara Desert, it was very green and lush. So like I live in Florida. So it was basically the same type of climate that we had in Florida. And again, none of this is disputed. Matter of fact, all of everything in the book and everything we're going to talk about, none of it actually contradicts any currently accepted, let's say mainstream, because that's a word we usually kind of rebel against, but it doesn't contradict anything that's in any of our textbooks. So no one's going to argue that the Green Sahara wasn't real in 9600 BC. We know that we had Lake Chad in the middle of Africa, which was the biggest freshwater lake on the planet at the time. There are ample rivers and all that stuff. So it's kind of the stage is set. It's a very, it's set very well. We also know in this region that there were people there. We found the tools, and they're the type of tools and the type of things that we would expect to find for Neolithic society. So basically stone tools, stone weapons, and things like that, which of course fits in with there being someone in this area. And then when you look at this Rishat structure thing, it would have been in the middle of this big lake, 10 miles on either side. I mean, a very substantial body of water. So if
that was a question I was going to ask about, if this area has ever been excavated or studied for any evidence of inhabitation, and you just answered that, but has the island itself been studied?
Yeah, so it's been looked at, and they've run lidar over it. We have a couple challenges. First off, 10,000 years is a very long time, and we also know that something like a tsunami hit it. And there's some lines I can read you about what Plato is trying to tell us about what the place looks like. But I've actually worked with a geologist who's also a geochemist, and we've looked at the place. And I also work with this fellow named David Stig Hansen. If you haven't heard of him, he actually has a YouTube channel called Was This Atlantis? And he's been there. He was there about a year and a half ago, and I'm helping fund another expedition back next month. Actually, we're going back, and we found. So first off, the place. This is the Sahara Desert. So we've got things like the French Foreign Legion. A lot of when you see the movies about the French Foreign Legion, a lot of that is filmed in this kind of same area, and that's where they were. So there are French Foreign Legion forts. So initially there was a lot of excitement because some structures were found, in the area and around this Rishat thing, but they don't look right. They're very crude. And when you really, really look at them, you can see what they are. Is they're French Foreign Legion forts, and they have slits where the guys could fire the guns and fight the Zulu, whoever they were fighting, and all of that. So we've got that. But what we have found there, I mentioned we found the tools, we found the proof of habitation. We've also found what Plato tells us about Atlantis, and we've got to get into this. Like you said, we're going backwards, so there's a lot of foundation I can lay for this. But one of the things that Plato tells us about Atlantis, we use this word advanced for Atlantis. And it's not. I hate to be the Grinch that stole Christmas, but it's not crystal death rays or UFOs or nuclear submarines. It's not any of that stuff around that word advanced. What they were advanced at is agriculture, as I mentioned, and being able to organize themselves. And we can talk about that, but they kind of go hand in hand. So what Plato tells us about the agriculture is that there was a plain, which we see in West Africa, that was 1,000 miles all the way around it. And it was divided into 60,000 10 stadia by 10 stadia farms, and each farm was owned by a landowner. Then they worked the land, and they did a lot of irrigation, and they did a lot of farming. Those farmers were responsible for supplying enough materials each for 1/6 of a war chariot. So there was 10,000. They had 10,000 war chariots, all that kind of stuff. So when you look at the agriculture, there's two spots we found. There's one spot that's about 10 miles to the north and a little east, which is in the first mountain range to the north, and then there's a spot more towards the south, towards the Atlantic Ocean. And you can see what I believe is kind of proto-terrace farming, and the ability to irrigate crops on a massive, massive scale. So we have that, and it's very interesting topology, because a lot of it goes under the sand. So the sand has covered a lot of these canals and a lot of these structures. And we're actually going to look at those in about a little more than a month. We'll be back on site, and there's some work we're going to do, because it looks like the geologist thinks that the area has been covered in something called evaporites, which, if Atlantis was destroyed in a tsunami, that's an awful lot of salt water. And what happens is, the salt water comes inland, and this is a lot. So it took years or decades for it to all drain back out. And we can see in the satellite photos, you can see the drainage pattern. But a lot of it didn't drain, a lot of it just evaporated. So when you get that much thick salt evaporated, and now the climate is transitioning to be a desert. What happens is it dries out and dries really hard, and it starts to look like something that looks like a rock. It's called an evaporite. But if you put water on it, you could eventually reconstitute it as salt. But it's formed over all these areas and all these canals. So I think we're going to get lucky, and I think that a lot of the signs of irrigation that will be the key to having something on the ground we can all look at and point to, I think they're going to be preserved by these evaporites, and we're going to know in about 6 weeks. So it's pretty exciting.
Yeah, when you look at the pictures of this site and the way that you detail how it aligns with Plato's descriptions and mathematics of all the areas that it's supposed to be, and the way that it aligns, what did you say, 98%, 99%?
Look, the math said 99.32%.
Okay, so close enough to 100% to make it very, very compelling, to say the least. So would you mind explaining how this site aligns to Plato's descriptions?
Sure. Yeah, so let's go through the details. So there's a couple things. There's a lot of build up to this. We're kind of jumping around a little bit, but the Plato, in Critias and Timaeus, he gives us a lot of information about Atlantis that we can deduce, but also in the narrative, Critias is talking, and he's talking because his great grandfather, a guy named Solon, had gone to Egypt. Solon, by the way, was a ancient Greek politician, and he was arguably the person that kind of figured out that democracy might be a good idea. So he kind of, to say he invented democracy is a little strong, but it was his idea, and it kind of what it led to what we see in the 4th century, which is what we call the classical Greece. But while he was trying to figure all that out, one of the trips he took was to Egypt, because Egypt was a long storied civilization, and he wanted to go talk to them about how they do things, and he was trying to learn and figure stuff out. While he was there, they talked about many things. One of the things that they got into was the Egyptian ancient history. And they had the hieroglyphics, and they walked around, and they hit the spot where they got to the story of Atlantis, and the priests there worked with him and helped him translate everything, and he wrote it all down in a scroll that he brought back to Greece with him. And in that scroll, pretty much was everything they knew, but it includes these measurements I'm about to go over. So a lot of things about the continent of Atlantis and the city of Atlantis and stuff like that. But Critias in Plato's dialogue is talking about what he's read, because Critias still has this scroll. So one misconception is that this is an oral tradition, but Plato goes out of his way to tell us it's not an oral tradition. So this stuff I'm about to read off to you here, it comes from the data. And what I did in the book, you've read the book, is I pull out everything Plato said about it, and then I kind of like break it all down into basically requirements. And I say, okay, it's got to be this, it's got to be this, it's got to be this, it's got to be this. And we go look to see if this place meets all those requirements. And if it does, it gets a check. If it partially does, we can discount it some. And if it doesn't, it doesn't get a check. And that's how we get to that 99.32%. And it's a nice way of doing it, because then if someone disagrees with any of the points, we can go look at the point. And maybe I gave it a 90 or 100, and maybe, arguably it should have been a 75 or, something like that. And then we can look at that number, but none of it takes that 99% down to any number that's going to be a problem. But here's the stuff he says. He says that they're really good at agriculture and all that stuff I mentioned. We have the Green Sahara, so that kind of hits for that. I mentioned the salt. In Mauritania, which is the country this is in, one of its biggest, it's not its biggest exports, but it exports hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of salt every year, because there's still salt all over the place, and salt mines are still a big part of Western and Central Western Africa's commerce. Plato tells us that Atlantis was rich in minerals. Precious metals. Mauritania's biggest export is gold and iron and precious metals, so it fits that bill. He tells us that the Atlanteans attacked and conquered Libya all the way up to Egypt, and they conquered parts of northern Europe all the way to Greece in the Mediterranean. So Atlantis has to be geographically related somehow to Egypt, Libya, Greece, and Europe. So, so that's why Antarctica, it could be there's something going on in Antarctica, but it's not the capital city of Atlantis, because if you're in Antarctica, even if there's no ice, it's 4,000 miles to attack Greece. You're just not going to do it. We wouldn't do it today, much less in 9600 BCE. But so it has to be geographically related to those. He tells us the size of the continent, which is why I think it's West Africa, and the size is massive. He says it's as big as Asia Minor and Libya put together. Well, that's over 1 million square miles. Now, the nice thing is, and by the way, so that means like the Azores and Spain and all those places, they're just not big enough. The Bimini, Florida, there's not enough land mass because this is a very, very, very big piece of land. Western Africa, and we're talking, as I mentioned, about from south of Morocco, Mauritania, and then east to Mali. It's about 2 million square miles. So it's bigger than Asia Minor and Libya combined. So it fits that. It's also bordered by the Atlas Mountains to the north, which that name Atlas is important because Atlas was the king of Atlantis. And we know that the Atlantic Ocean is named after Atlantis. And Plato tells us also that there were some not so super great impressive mountains on one of the borders, which is what we find in Chad and Mali, on that side. So it fits all of that. This Rishat structure meets the kind of the prototypical requirement of a center island surrounded by two rings of land, all surrounded by water. So it's like the only place that really has that look to it. So we have that. He says that the stones and the rocks were white, black, and red. Well, the stones in the area, even today, they are white, black, and red. So we can still find that. And then this one's interesting. This one is always ignored. When we watch those TV shows, and I've watched all of them, or we read the books, they always kind of, they'll find a little island somewhere, Santorini or whatever. But here's what Plato tells us. He tells us that Atlantis was on a, let me just read it. I like to read this before I try and explain to people. So this is something he says about Atlantis. He says, the country immediately about and surrounding the city was a level plain, itself surrounded by mountains, which descended towards the sea. That's important. It was smooth and even, of an oblong shape, extending in the one direction, 3,000 stadia. So I mentioned stadia before. So what's a stadia? Stadia is 607 feet. 3,000 stadia times 607 feet, that comes out to 345 miles. So the way to read this is that Atlantis was inland. Now, it has to be accessible by a river, and there is, and there's a river there, and it's in a big lake, but it's 345 miles inland, 3,000 stadia. So you go look, and you measure the Rishat structure, and how far do you think it is from the Atlantic Ocean?
Oh, you want me to answer?
Well,
I'm terrible at math.
It's 345 miles.
Okay.
So it's in other words, this passage that I just read to you, which is very much part of Plato's definition of Atlantis, it's always ignored. This is one of the things I typically start with is we have to push all of this secondary material, secondary sources to the side. And secondary meaning all the speculation that people have done. We got to go to the source material. So if he tells us it's 3,000 stadia from the sea on a gently sloping plain, then that's what we got to find. And now that is what we find with the Rishat structure, which is kind of amazing. He tells us that a 50 stadia canal was dug from the outer ring to an inner harbor. Well, that gives us the radius of the landmass of the concentric circles. So how big do you think the radius is of the Rishat structure? It's about
just what you said.
That's what I said. Yeah. So 50 stadia times 607 feet is 5.8 miles. And it's 5.8 miles from the outer ring to the inner ring. He says there was an inner harbor. When you look at the center of the Rishat structure, there is a big circle dug out. He also tells us that they mined stone from underneath the center island. There it is. And it would have been the inner harbor. When you add water to this structure, it's very clearly a nice little harbor. He tells us there were hot and cold springs. The Rishat structure was formed as a volcanic dome, they call it. So it was an active volcano at the time. Well, volcanoes are hot, so that's how you can get hot and cold running springs that way. He tells us there are lots of elephants. Well, this part of Africa still today, we're just a couple hundred miles north of the Congo, and there's elephants everywhere. What's left of them, but there's tons of them. There certainly would have been a lot of them in Plato's time. He tells us there were green mountains to the north. Well, Green Sahara, and there are mountains to the north of this thing. He tells us that Atlantis, as I said, had mountains to the north and open to the south. The Rishat structure has mountains to the north, about 10 miles to the north, and it opens to the south. He tells us it was directly outside the the Pillars of Hercules, which we interpret as the Strait of Gibraltar. When you look at West Africa, now a lot of people want direct to mean you go like direct west out, but when you look at the geography, down the coast of West Africa, past Morocco, and then to Mauritania, that's more the straight line. And to kind of prove that, because this is a point of contention for people that like the Azores. And by the way, I think the Azores were part of Atlantis. I just think they were a province, not the capital. But when you look at how Columbus, right? Columbus in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Well, how did he go? Did he go from Spain to the Azores, straight across to Cuba and the Bahamas there? No, he didn't. He went down the coast of Africa to the Canary Islands and then went across because that's where the currents take you. Plato also said that the way to Atlantis was the way to the opposite continent. So now we've got, Egyptians in 600 BCE knowing about the opposite continent. But one misconception, the opposite continent is not North America, it's South America, because that's actually where the tidal flows of the ocean take you. And that's actually how Columbus did it too. He took the same route because he was subject to the same physics and the same waters as the Atlanteans would have been. So, all of those things kind of add up. And then there's other contexts I can set, but that's some of the raw data that really aligns this location to Plato's description of Atlantis.
Yeah. When before I read your book, it's been a while since I've even read anything on Atlantis. I don't know why it became jaded to me, because it always ended with the same story, but we're not certain if this is the place. We're convinced that it is, but we have no definitive proof. And so you just check out after a while.
Right.
And so, but one of the things that definitively proved it to me that you're on the right track is the fact that the way to get into this area was flooded by mud to where it was blockaded. So
yeah.
An island cannot be blockaded by mud. How much mud flow does it take to blockade an island? An island is water
yeah.
on all sides, so that has to be inland. And then when you add, like you said, that's bigger than Asia and Libya, so you're talking about a continent. You're not talking about an island.
Well, that's right. See, and right, they call it was blocked by a shawl of mud, and then everyone just kind of like, they'll say something offhand about it to like claim it meets their scenario or whatever, but then they just miss it. But to be blocked by a shawl of mud, there has to be a narrow waterway. And we see that, by the way, in about halfway between the Rishat structure and the Atlantic Ocean, there are big mounds of mud. we look at them today. We can still see them. So yeah, I mean, exactly. And when you allow yourself to take in all of the points and not dismiss any, then this becomes really the only place that fits. The other thing I want to say, you mentioned that, and I often tell the story like this, which is, as a kid growing up, I watched all the TV shows, and I grew up in the 70s and 80s, so I know that's viewed as a long time ago. Now I'm an old guy, but even today, the shows, if there's a show on about Atlantis, I watch it. I used to read all the books, but there's too many books now, and most of them are nonsense. But the show's always had the same formula, which is the first half, they set you up, they tell you they've got it figured out. You see amazing scenery. They give you all the coincidental things that line up. And then first half, and then in the second half, they do what you said. They say, but we don't know. We have to look. And as I'm watching it, what I've learned is what they really doing. I mean, they got like a 3-week travel vacation out of it, right? Because they always think Atlantis is like the best destinations in the world. It's the Greek islands, or right, Malta, or the Azores, or right, the Bahamas. And so they're going to all these great places, and they scuba dive and all this stuff, but it's nonsense. It's got nothing to do with searching for Atlantis. It's just entertaining television, and I watch it and I'm entertained, but it's the same thing. You can only take so much of it, right? Because it's like you watch it, and it's like, okay, I don't care. I've seen the 7 places they're going to talk about. I know what they're going to say, and in the end is always going to be the same, which is we don't know.
Right, and I'd much rather hang out in the Bahamas than the Sahara.
Well, yeah, no, today, this place is it's terrible where it is. I mean, it's 135 degrees. There's no infrastructure at all for hundreds of miles. So yeah, it's in a tough place right now.
As you said earlier, Plato received his information vicariously through the tale of Solon's trip to Egypt. My question is why, if this inland city of Atlantis, as you describe it, is not the highly advanced futuristic society we romanticize it to be, then why would Egyptian high priests living amongst the most incredible architectural feats of mankind have any interest in retelling such a seemingly insignificant people?
Sure, because first off, they weren't insignificant. They conquered Libya up to Egypt, and they conquered parts of Europe. And it took the Greeks and whatever was going on in Greece in 9600 BCE, Proto-Greeks, whatever you want to call them, to push them back. So it was a great war. It was basically a world war from a Mediterranean standpoint. That's thing one. But I agree with you. That's not super duper interesting. But here's what's really interesting is the Atlanteans were good at agriculture. We talked about that. That's worth noting. But they were also really good at organizing themselves. Matter of fact, they were probably, as far as we're ever going to know, huge thought leaders in how they organize themselves. So, and here's what I mean by that. Not only did they have the provinces and the landowners, and they had to, submit treasure or whatever, to have chariots and all that, but there was the kingdom of Atlantis, and there were 9 provinces ruled by a prince. So there were 10 rulers, and they made an agreement. This first time I've ever known this to happen. And they said, basically, we can't attack each other, no wars between us. And if any of us are attacked, all other provinces have to come to their aid. So basically, they invented NATO in 9600 BCE. And that's worth noting. I mean, so if you're running a country, or if you're the Egyptians and you're smart and you're looking at all of that, that's a structure that is worth preserving. They had lots of other rules. They had all this written on a stela in the middle in the palace. They basically had the rules, and they were simple. The only other rules they had, I think, was the local princes, they can govern however they want. However, unless it's a matter of state or super duper important, they can't sentence people to death without bringing it to the other provinces or the other princes and at least talking about it, that kind of stuff. But I think it's the socio-political structure that warrants remembering. And I think that's why the Egyptians took the time to record it.
So I understand that you're trying to take all the speculation out of it and all the supernatural and stuff like that.
I am.
And I appreciate that, because it does need to be done. But I have to say, David, Plato's tale of Atlantis isn't without its supernatural details. It's not all facts, figures, geography, and mapping. Atlantis, after all, was destroyed by the gods. Atlas was the son of Poseidon, one of 5 sets of twins, which seems pretty bizarre itself. So the kingdoms of these other twins, is there any evidence of them and their names in the surrounding areas? Is there perhaps any statistical increase in twins in the area, or other such secondary evidence?
Yeah. So look, it's a really good question. And we have some clues to this. Okay. So he tells us all of their names, and it is a little confusing. Let me add some perspective to Plato real quick, and then I'll answer your question. But I want to expand on what you said, because Plato, you mentioned some kind of supernatural or fantastical things. He's got 2 other dialogues. He wrote, I don't know, like 40 dialogues. He wrote a ton of dialogues, but he's got 2 other ones that deal with this idea of cataclysms wiping out civilization. So we've got Timaeus and Critias, which specifically reference Atlantis. But then we have the laws that talks about, basically the premise of the laws, which was written after Critias, is that, all the civilizations on the planet get wiped out periodically about every 12,000 years. This time when they get wiped out, let's think about how it might be fun to build back. So there's all that type of speculation. And then he's got another one called The Statesman, which is, it's flat out bonkers. He's got time travel in it. He's got people being unborn and coming back from the dead and digging out of graves, Fountain of Youth type stuff. So Plato is not above, kind of the fanciful. What he does do, though, is very specific. He says that the stuff that Critias is telling us, he believes to be true. Okay. And then he also says, and here are the names of all the other places. He says, here's the names of the princes. I try not to speculate. I think the name of the prince and the name of the place, just like Atlas, Atlas, Atlantis, I think there's a relationship. So he tells us there's 10, like you said. And I'm writing a second book on this. And I've been doing the linguistic analysis. And I think we can find some places that we know with phonetically those names have survived, that if we have, because we have the city of Atlantis, right, the capital, we have the continent of Atlantis, West Africa, and then we have the kingdom of Atlantis, which is what we're talking about now. These 10 provinces, counting the continent. So like the eldest of the 5th set of twins, his name was Azes. That sounds a lot like Azores, right? So, and it would make sense. He calls them diving islands, and that's what the Azores are. So I looked up, well, where does that name Azores come from? No one knows. They know it derives from Spanish. Well, okay. Some people like Spain because they found what looks like agriculture and some of these advanced earthworks, just like they want to find for Atlantis. It's not big enough to be Atlantis, the capital, but Plato tells us that the Atlanteans conquered parts of Europe. We have found in Spain what looks like the type of things we would expect to find if we're looking for this time period. And then we have a name, the Azores, that has its root in Spanish. It talks about these islands that people like. So I think the Azores is a place we can look at. He has this term called Emilius or Gadirius, which is a lot like what we call the Canary Islands, the Canarias. So, which are right outside of where this would have been. They're right off the coast of West Africa. So I think that was a province. He has the Amphors, which if you look, there's the Amphor Seamount, which a lot of people like. It's right off the coast of Spain. I think this would probably be the name for the Spanish inland that people have found and like. Everman, which sounds a lot like Avalon phonetically. A lot of people like Ireland, and they think maybe when the water was lower there was more land there, and a lot of people say, well, that's Atlantis. Well, it's not the capital of Atlantis. That's what everyone just wants. Everyone only wants one answer. The capital was the Rishat structure, but it was a province, and then it fits all the other stuff that they found. He mentions Mimesis, which is the Minoans, right? A lot of people like Minoan, and there's a lot in the Minoan culture that looks kind of foreign to us, and it looks pseudo-Atlantean, but it was a province and it was ruled by a king. So this kind of fits that. Now, also the Minoans were super interesting because we've interpreted linear B, which dates back to the Bronze Age in ancient Greece, but no one can read linear A, which was the language they used before that, and no one can read what they call Minoan script, which was the language they used before that. So we see the traces of an ancient language that we still can't interpret, but we can see, you can see, you can't see the end of the road, but you can see that the road goes on. So we see that there. Now there's some names that I can't figure out where they were, which could be all these other places that people like. But no, the trail is absolutely there. And then one other thing, you didn't ask it, but it's kind of part of the question. When Plato was done, Plato gives us the chain of custody of the information from the Egyptians through Solon, through Crantor to him. But we also have the chain of custody, after Plato passed, what happened? This was such a big deal. It's kind of like your same question. If this is such a big deal, well, why didn't anyone do anything with this, back in the time? But they actually did. Plato created the first university called the Academy. That was kind of his thing. And he had two students. He had a lot of students, but two of his main students are Aristotle, who we all know when we talk about, and Aristotle went on to tutor Alexander the Great. And then he had another student called Crantor. Now, when Plato passed, both Aristotle and Crantor were up to take over and run the Academy for Plato. But Crantor kind of won out, and Crantor got the job. So Aristotle was kind of miffed about it, and that's why he went off and did his own thing. Aristotle was not a huge Plato fan. He learned a lot from him, but then he split from a lot of Plato's thoughts and came up with his own. Crantor, which is probably why he got the job, he was a huge Plato fan. So he actually was so enthralled by this story of Atlantis that he says he went to Egypt and verified the source material. So then we have the lineage down to Plato, and then we have contemporaries of Plato, verifying the material. So I think it's all an interesting story.
The way I interview is the way that my brain works, which is dancing back and forth,
Sure, that's fine. It's good.
So I don't have a good segue for this, so I'm just going to ask a question. The god Atlas was a titan, so a giant. If you lend any validity to Madame Blavatsky and her occultic overviews, she claimed the Atlanteans were giants. We have the Nephilim and the Great Flood, Gilgamesh, the Watchers, and that deluge, as well as various tales of heaven descending giants and great floods across cultures all over the world. So, David, do you accept the prospect of an antediluvian global culture and intellectual network involving giants and catastrophe?
I accept the premise of a global seafaring group of people. I think that's just obvious. For the rest of it, it's above my pay grade. I am very purposefully staying in the literal box when it comes to this, because I don't want to have to defend my views on giants or comet impacts or any of that stuff. I don't want that to seep into what has been discovered and what is provable about the Atlantis. So I'm not answering.
So I'll ask you another question that you won't answer.
Okay, good.
Edgar Casey envisioned the Atlanteans as being the predecessors of the ancient Egyptians. Do you believe it a possibility that we are all descendants of Atlantis?
Okay, that's a good question in that. And I mentioned one of the things when I started this, I sat down and I said, I have to figure out what is meant by the term evidence. What is evidence, right? And then Plato's a primary source for Atlantis. A lot of this other stuff, it's kind of speculative, if you will. And what was the exact question again?
Oh, I was asking about Edgar Casey, the famous guy who
I know who
in the 1920s, 1930s, who'd go into trances, and a lot of his stuff, they focused on Atlantis. So I asked, I think as I read it, I think I wrote it kind of weird, but I said Edgar Casey envisioned the Atlanteans as being the predecessors of the ancient Egyptians.
Yeah.
Do you believe it a possibility that we are all descendants of Atlantis? Because there are many others who speculate that we all are descendants of Atlantis and ancient Egypt.
So here's what we know. History tells us that our current species of human came out of Africa. Atlantis, I believe, was one of the first civilizations in Africa. Well, it just makes sense when you look at this place, when you look at the time, there were people there. They have to be crazy not to go live on this thing. I mean, it's the perfectly defensible. It's a perfect place to live. So I think the DNA evidence supports that, and I think that Atlantis supports that. So I don't think it's unreasonable. Plato doesn't talk about it though, so it's again it is a little outside of my my expertise. I don't think it's unreasonable given other things that point to Africa as the starting place for all the stuff that we know.
Well, I have to say that I believe that speculation is a part of science because, after all, what is hypothesis in the end? It's educated speculation.
I don't disagree with you at all. I have to maintain my box because I think this is Atlantis, and I don't want people to be able to argue fringe points and bring that into my credibility or the other details, because that's how we all are. If we can, the way we work today is if we don't like someone or we don't like an argument, if we can find one thing wrong with it, we think we've popped the balloon, right? So if someone says, well, the giants are stupid, so David didn't find Atlantis.
Right.
Okay. And I deal with that. I deal with this all the time. I mean, and people are constantly trying to get me into an argument where they think they have a counter argument for it, so that by kind of winning that, everyone wants to win. By winning that, they can then say, well, if you're wrong on that, then you're just wrong. And what are you doing? So that's why I stay away from some of those answers.
Right. I understand why that's a smart standpoint to stay at.
I don't disagree with you at all. You're right, by the way, but I have to maintain my, my literal ability here.
I have to ask the questions. That's my job. Perhaps Plato, being a philosopher and not a historian, chose to insert the ideas of his republic as well as write his bias for an Athenian defeat over the Atlanteans for analogous purposes, although the background details are based in truth of a real land and people. Would you agree or disagree to this possibility?
Well, here's what Plato
said. And I'll
said.
emphasize possibility.
Well, no, I have a specific answer for this one. Plato, first off, we call Plato a philosopher. He would not have seen himself as a philosopher, and I don't really think that's what he was, in as much as he was recording the history of his teacher Plato, which is where he started, and then from that he started to, because of Socrates, he started to take Socrates' ideas and make sure that he was showing those in his dialogues. But he's not writing. I don't think he would have thought he was writing philosophy. I would think he thought he was recording what happened. And that's what a historian does, number one. Number two, he's very meticulous about, in his dialogues, telling us when he's using an analogy, when he's using lore, or when he thinks he's telling us something of fact. So Socrates was a real person. He was a fact. Plato wrote the Apology of Socrates, Socrates' defense at his trial, because the Athenians put Socrates to death, and that's presented as a fact. Now, what Socrates is saying is very philosophical, but Plato's just recording it. So we all in 10th grade, probably ninth or 10th grade, we all carried around Plato's Republic, big thick book. None of us read it. Even I didn't read it, and I'm into this stuff, but they told me to read it, so I'm not reading it. It's just no way. I've read it since. I've read it a couple times since. In the Republic, his most famous allegory is the cave. This is what everyone references. Well, the cave, and then Socrates through the course of the Republic and the dialogue, they speculate on if we could make the perfect city, what would it look like? But Plato says it's made up. He says it's an allegory. He says, imagine if you were in a cave and there were shadows on the wall, all this stuff. And he's trying to define the form of things. Is justice a thing, or is it just the biggest guy with the biggest rock, or whatever? So in his dialogues, he's very good about telling us when he's making it up. When it comes to Critias and Atlantis, he goes out of his way to tell us he believes it's true and to provide the chain of custody for the information. And that's all an historian today could do, is they could tell us whether they think something is baloney or not, and they could tell us where the information comes from. That's all they do. So he was very much a historian, and when it comes to Atlantis, he very much believed it's true. He could be wrong, but it's almost impossible. How could he have made all this up as an allegory, and we found a place on the planet that meets it perfectly? You know what I mean? People want it to be, and that's one of the counter arguments I get. Well, it was an oral tradition. He clearly just made it up. It's like, that's not even an argument. That's just that's an unfounded statement. But no, Plato thought this was real. Plato, I think, viewed himself more as a historian, and he is certainly doing what historians today do in his reporting of this.
All right, I totally dig that passion. So here I'm going to come back with another speculative question, because I just have to do it.
Sure.
Sir Francis Bacon wrote The New Atlantis, which, just as Plato's Atlantis, is an unfinished work, as they say, not completed. Or could it be that they were actually finished in the secret society? Ancient mystery schools confiscated the details that truly speak of our human history and what they don't want us to know about our origins.
That's what I think happened. I think it was finished. Matter of fact, the point at which it cuts off is just the most bizarre point. We're about to get a big speech where it's all going to be laid out and come together, and it just stops. If you look at the chain, like, there's things we don't know today. So, for example, we don't know what Plato wrote on. Did he write on wax paper? I mean, he didn't have, I don't think he had a chisel and he's chiseling into rock. But we don't know. Did he have ink? We don't know. There's been a lot of calamities in the area. We're incredibly lucky because all of the Platonic dialogues that we have were preserved. And I think they eventually made their way into church basements and stuff, and then they were kind of found again. So it's possible that it was just lost. It's more likely, to your point, just like the Book of Enoch, and just like other works that we have, that what he was about to say would have given us would have been completely definitive, where you don't have to read my book to figure it out. We just read it and we'll know it, and it somehow disappeared. So I actually believe that. I don't know if that's not part of my analysis of Atlantis, but after reading all of his other stuff, and I feel like I know the guy a little bit, he certainly didn't. What people want to say is, well, he got halfway done, he realized he'd written himself in a corner, he threw his pen down in disgust, and it's like, oh, that's just not who this guy is, and that's not what he was doing in this thing. So I think it existed, and I think it's gone.
Yeah, and it's bizarre that there's a parallel with Sir Francis Bacon as well, who may have very well been one of the founding members of the Rosicrucians, which is that inside secret society inside of the Freemasons. So that he too was not a type of guy who's just going to leave anything incomplete. It's just bizarre, and
And Plato didn't die in the middle of this, because he wrote dialogues after it. So,
right.
Yeah. And he didn't leave anything unfinished. So, yeah.
So one must ask, if there is no true actual physical evidence of any ancient island-dwelling society of high-tech Fantasia engineers, then what is it about human psychology that imprints these myths upon our distant past? I propose the possibility that perhaps within our DNA is encoded the memories of a lost past more advanced than we dare entertain. What say you, David? Why do you think high-tech, futuristic, crystal-powered utopia is where our minds go with Atlantis?
I feel like you're reading Lord of the Rings to me. That's awesome. So, look, I mean, that if I understand the question, The question is pretty much, why is Atlantis? Why are we all so drawn to this thing? What makes it so interesting? And not just Atlantis, but a lot of other places. And here's what I think it is. I think we're wired for it. Now, we could speculate on why we're wired for it. And I watched a lot of Ancient Aliens, and I have kooky beliefs, have nothing to do with Atlantis, but we're clearly wired for it. We are a people. If you were to put, if you were to put, lock me, you, or probably any other person on the planet in a room, a big, bright 10 by 10 room, and there's a box in the middle and a chair, and the box says, "Do not lift," and we're just in that room, eventually we're going to go lift the box up. It's just what we do, right? We can't help it. We can't, our minds don't work. We don't like closed doors. So I think that's part of it. I think when you look at a lot of the Mesoamerican cultures, you look at the Inca and the Aztecs and all of that, and you look at those structures. When you look at Egypt, when we look at these buildings, just as we just look at them, you can tell there's something going on. You can tell, these giant stones and all that stuff, and it's breathtaking. And then the answer you're given is, oh yeah, they made it like a couple thousand years ago, and like 80 guys did it with a stick, and just like, no, there's just no way. It doesn't make sense. And they ask questions, and then they come back, and you kind of get in trouble for asking questions. And I think that's just like, it's just like poking the bear. It's just poking the bear. And I think we all want to know, we become intrigued because it doesn't look right to us, and the answers that we're given don't seem logical.
Right. And this whole, it's on an island in the middle of azure blue. It's so fantastical, and it's perfect for movie scripts. And I understand why you gravitate to the middle of the ocean or somewhere off the coast. But where you have located it makes so much more sense as a place that you would put your main grounds, your main center hub, your main center city, especially when you look at defense and commerce and all these other tactical arrangements geographically.
No, that's exactly right. And I don't think they strategically picked it. I think it's just such a fertile, well-defended paradise that, and like we said, and you can start to do agriculture, you can start to specialize. No one can attack you. They can't even get to you without weeks journey, and you can have all kinds of defenses. You don't have to worry about pointed sticks because you got animals coming at you. You can start to grow as a civilization. And as people, it just seems to be, once we have a successful civilization, we either want to completely screw it up, or we start attacking our neighbor, which seems to be what the Atlanteans did. So it just makes sense. I think once you really look at it and you accept what it would have been like during the time, I think if we're all honest and logical, it's a lot harder to explain why on earth humans wouldn't have gone to this geography and this island and all of these things, and this lake and this fertile valley and all these things. Why wouldn't they have gone there and lived there? Of course they would have. I mean, they're not idiots. They're staring at this place, and you're getting chased by saber-toothed tigers over here, and all you got to do is get over there, and you're living in paradise. So of course you'd go there.
Yeah, and the more power, resources, and conveniences you have, the more power, resources, and conveniences you need.
Yeah,
so you're going to attack everybody surrounding you, and the more they want it from you, so the more you have to build up to protect yourself against them. So I can understand why, if you are in this fertile area and you have, like it says, all these minerals, and it's fertile, and they have hot springs and cool springs, so you have temperature controlled,
you got hot showers,
springs.
Man.
It's
awesome.
Who's not going to want to impede on your luxury home over there? So so you have to continually go outward, because they're coming inward to try to take what you have. It's just a natural reaction.
Well, and it's just like Troy. We used to think Troy was made up, but now Schliemann found it. But one of the reasons why Troy was successful is because they were positioned on the Black Sea, and they could control commerce. Well, Atlantis was the same way. I mean, they were on the way to the opposite continent, as Plato tells us. And when you look where they are, it's just a wonderful maritime trading place. You got this nice river. You can see people coming for days and days and days. It's a great place to visit, and all of that. So yeah, and so they're going to be rich. They're going to be, very wealthy, well off. They've got all the food they could ever want to eat. They've got 60,000 farmers who contribute to the war effort. Yeah, I mean, to see that happen, and then over time to see them attack into the Mediterranean, that's how human history works.
And so they had this inlet into the area that they were staying, from the sea, and they are seafaring people. So all these other sites that are of the same time period could have been of Atlanteans, but as you said, is not the capital city, right?
It's just not the capital city, but they're part of the kingdom. They're province, and Plato tells us this. He said there were 10. There was a capital and 9 other provinces, and he said some were diving islands, and he gives us names we can kind of trace, and the geography makes sense. And people become passionate because they think that is Atlantis proper. I always say, we got Atlantis with a capital A, which is the Rishat structure, and then we've got the kingdom, Atlantis with the small a, and that's all these other places. So if the Rishat structure was Atlantis, and if Plato is taken 100% literally, it unifies all of those things. It unifies what everyone believes. There can still be a lost civilization on Antarctica. The Azores could have had more land and been doing really cool stuff. There could be crazy farming in Spain that they found. And they were all associated with Atlantis. They were provinces of Atlantis. They were part of that Atlantis treaty, where if someone attacked them, the other 9 provinces came to their defense. It just makes sense. And it works. And I think it's real history.
So, do you have any idea of how long this civilization lasted?
That's a good question. We know when it ended. We know that agriculture started about 400 years before. We know that before that, when you move back into the Ice Age, there was stuff going on, but it's so hard to tell. Just like I mentioned, Troy and Sleeman and all of those things. When they say they found Troy, they'll say, yeah, we excavated Troy and we think it's level 7. Okay, well, what does that mean? Okay, well, that means that people, they build on top and on top and on top. And that's one of the problems we have with all these sites, which is, if there's a cataclysm, and let's say they built with giant stones and half of it got wiped out, takes a couple hundred years, people come back, they find these sites, they start to rebuild them. But now when we look at it, we're confused because we think the rebuilders were the builders. You know what I mean? So it becomes really hard to date. And the other problem we have is because we're talking about the Neolithic and there's stone tools, you can't date stone. Like I said, I think the whale bones they found were dated to 9600 BC. However long before it, I don't know. I'm going to guess. So I'm speculating. No, doesn't come from Plato or anything. Probably about 400 years. Because if we look to the beginning of agriculture to where it ends up 400 years later at this place, that seems like about the right amount of time for the civilization to do what Plato tells us the civilization did.
I forgot to write this word down, so forgive me if I'm way off, but I think I'll get close enough that you'll know what I'm saying. The metal, is it orichalcum?
I read it down to, saying, yeah, it's like orichalcum. That word is a bear of a word, the way it's written. Where do I have that in my notes?
Do you have any idea of what that metal is?
No one knows. We know, I can't find that in my notes real quick, but yeah, so it's today they think it might be a name for like mountain copper kind of stuff, or mountain bronze. But no one really knows. It's kind of lost. Now, Plato says it glowed kind of like gold, a rich color, and they used it a lot. So the best guess is it might be some kind of combination of gold and copper, or gold and bronze. Some people have speculated that it might be platinum, but I've not found evidence that platinum in any large supply has been found near Mauritania. It could be iron. Now, and iron would be really interesting if that's what it is, because iron gets harder than these other metals. So if you make weapons out of it, it's a really good material for that. But we don't find any evidence of that, or of smelts. I also mentioned that we're talking about the pre-pottery Neolithic, which is the time period. That just means just before clay pottery. But all pottery is heating up mud, making it hot. So, but those are advances in technology that seem to have come later. So the answer is no one knows. It's probably some combinations of metals that we understand, but there's no way to know.
Well, what I'm going to say is it's probably something that interacts with the crystal energies and powers their spaceships. That's what I'm going to say.
I read your book. I remember reading that. Yeah.
So, in wrapping up here, how do you compare Plato's description of Atlantis, their society, their social structure and downfall, with the Great Reset of today's Aquarian deluge? What can we learn from a people buried beneath the sands of mystery?
Oh boy, that's a very good question. Um, I don't. I have to make sure I think to my answer, because one of my rules is we can't talk politics. And that almost leads me into a political answer. I'll say it this way: when you read Plato and you look at the examples he picks for his dialogues, and he is doing multiple things in the dialogues, he is trying to figure out basically, is justice something we can all agree on and then apply? Or is justice very much in the moment and is more the will of the stronger or the mob or that kind of stuff? And I don't think he ever found a good answer to that. I think that when you look at the Atlanteans, what we know about them from his dialogues, they became, I don't want to say arrogant, we use that too much, but they expanded beyond their military capability. He tells us that. And I think we struggle with these same questions today, right? Which is, no matter what side of the political argument you're on, we all feel like we're getting lied to, and we all feel like we're getting screwed. And that's new. That 10 years ago, we really didn't feel that way. It's a very new conundrum. And then the question becomes, well, is there a right way to do things? And if there is, how do we know what it is? And can we agree on it before we do it? And we're working through that today. And these are the same problems the Atlanteans were trying to figure out. And they're the same things that Plato was trying to figure out.
Well, I don't want to argue your wrap up, but 10 years ago, I was definitely feeling that I was being lied to and deceived and screwed over. I think I felt that right out of the womb.
Well, let me put it, okay, I don't disagree with you. And maybe it's just become more pronounced today. I notice it more today. I notice it almost always now. And 10 years ago, I might have felt it sometimes, but I don't know that I was bombarded by it in the same way that I am now. But not arguing the close.
I get that. So your book, it's Atlantis Solved, and I would just encourage everybody to give that a read, because it is absolutely convincing. And when you just right out of the gate looking at the picture and then seeing how it measures up with Plato's description, I don't have any solid argument against it. And just that new framework for Atlantis, just to revive it for me, I feel it palpitating. And so, a new surge of maybe delving back into Plato and all of that. And it's also a very easy read. It's not, some of these are a bit over the top and, a bit too fanciful, and you get, blah about it. You kind of
just paint like they feel like the book's got to be 900 pages, and they go on and on and on, and I purposely didn't do that. It's very accessible. It's a little dry or a little academic-y, but not so much that detracts from the reading. It keeps, and it's very, I try to make it very clean so you can look at it. And actually the book frustrates a lot of people. I can't remember if I said this or not already, but a lot of people, they want to argue this, and they read the book and they get frustrated because you have to argue the actual details, and you can have a different interpretation than what I have, but that doesn't change whether my interpretation is right or not. So it hasn't been done this way in a book before. And I think it makes the case. I truly, that's why I'm going on your podcast and another podcast. So I think we found it. Now we just got to get the word out.
Definitely. Yeah. Like I said, like you said, it's not one of those thick 500-page books that you're just going through cited resources and just banging your head against the desk like, I got to get through this. I want to be smart and get through this. No, it's a good read, and it keeps you it keeps you into it. Like you're like, wow, yeah, this is the place, and I want to see this place. And then you're like, wait, it's the Sahara. Maybe I don't want.
You
But
you want to see it, you just don't want to. You probably don't want to go there. I mean, you're
right.
welcome to go there. It's a beautiful people country, but it's 135 degrees and it's 345 miles from anything. So good luck.
So I appreciate the work you put into it, and keep doing what you're doing, brother.
All right, Josh. Thank you very much, sir. Great show. Keep doing what you're doing too. This is a great podcast. You're very professional, and you're very prepared, which I appreciated. So I wish you nothing but success.
All right, thank you very much. You take care.
You too.
How easy it is to lose course, lose sight, lose the plot, lose minds, lose love, life, and time. How many ventures we set out into as to lose ourselves in the moment. Yet getting lost is not all gloom and despair. It is the surest way to finding new destinations. After all, one man's loss is another man's find. Like brushing your feet through the grains of beach as you walk the shoreline, kicking up an old shiny object. Yesteryear's lost trinket, today's found gem. Truth be told, I can find nothing more enlightening than getting lost. Yes, indeed, let us all get lost. Let us be as Atlanteans, shedding our cloak to the seeker's eyes, bear our true nature from our hidden depths. We are all as Atlantis, lost to be found. We are the children of the flood, washed away along with our memories, drifters of aimlessness, yet upon currents of Poseidon's rhythmic heartbeat. Get lost, my friends, and there you will find the gods of antiquity. There you will find the lost city of you, I, and us. Get lost, get found. Love, peace, happiness. Signing off. Deuces.